Alright, this is the Unit 23 video lesson over evidence of evolution. So during Unit 21 and 22 so far, we've talked about the history of evolution, the theory developed by Charles Darwin in Unit 21, and in Unit 22 you discussed different mechanisms of evolution besides natural selection. And so now Unit 23 is going to take us through different pieces of evidence that scientists use to back up and support the theory of evolution. So make sure you are filling in your evidence of evolution interactive notebooking as you watch the video, and that will be checked off for a grade. So here we go. Alright, under the first flap, which is titled Embryology and DNA Comparison, this will be where you're writing your first bit of information. So when we look at how things are connected, how things have evolved, one of the pieces of evidence that we can look at is embryology. Now, embryology and DNA comparison are both going to allow us to look at how things are related at a molecular level instead of the macro level where we can see things with our eyes. So before we get into that, let's start by addressing the fact that evolution is a theory, and in science, remember that theories mean something. And so when we say evolution is a theory, this means that we have evidence to support it, and it is widely accepted by scientists. So it's a theory that has been tested with and has empirical proof, which is the evidence we're going to be discussing today, with a large amount of evidence, and that can allows us to conclude that evolution has occurred both in the past and it's still taking place today. All right, so here we go. Now, whenever you do your evidence of evolution POGIL activity, you're going to look at different pieces of evidences and kind of work through them and compare to see how things compare on an evolutionary standpoint. Now, if we look at the embryology or how embryos develop, we can see that different types of embryos develop very similarly inside the uterus of the mother during development. So it can be very difficult to tell difference. So for instance, over here we have on the far left we have a pig development, and on the far right we have human development. So if you look over here at the beginning, in these early stages of embryological development, we can see that the embryos are very, very similar. And still, even in the second stage, they're still very similar. And it's not until we get to the last stage that they begin to differentiate into what they're going to end up being, okay, or looking like. So we can see that as the embryo develops, it starts out very similarly, which points back to the idea that all living organisms came from some common ancestor. So when we first start developing, we look very similar, we develop similarly, which points back to a common ancestor for living organisms on Earth. So that is embryos. Right, now in addition to comparing embryology of living organisms, we can also compare DNA. Okay, so we've studied DNA. We know that DNA has 4 bases, adenine, guanine, thymine, and cytosine, and we know that the order of those bases determines the genetic makeup of the organism. Okay, so we can change the order of those bases only slightly to go from a chimpanzee to a human, or from a human to a bacteria. So the order of our bases is what makes us who we are. All right, so when we compare the order of the bases and we see how many of these bases they have in common, that's going to give us the information on how closely related they are. So for instance, the more bases that match, the more similar the two organisms are to one another. Okay, so if we have say 45 bases in common out of 50 bases, we're going to be more similar to each other than if we only had 35 bases in common. So the greater number of bases in common, the more closely related those organisms are going to be. You could see something like this if you're asked about this on a test or whatever. So for instance, if they give you a base pair sequence of A, T, G, C, C, G, A, C, okay, we'll say this is a human sequence. We can say, and then I'll give you one that says A, T, T, C, C, G, A, C. We'll say this is a chimpanzee. And then I'll give you one that says A, T, A, G, C, G, A, C. And we'll say this is a frog. Okay, I'm just making these up, all right? These are just random sequences. Now, the question could go, say something like, compare these sequences, which organism is the human most closely related to? So if we were going to look at this, we would go through here and we would say A, T, T, G goes with G, C, C, or no, G goes with G, so there's a T there, so that's changed. But that looks like it's the only difference. So there's only one difference between the human and the chimp sequence. If we look at between the human, if we compare the human and the frog, we have A, T, T, G, A is different, C, G is different. Then we have C, C, G, G, A, C, C. So we see we have two differences here between the human and the frog. So the answer to the question then would be that the human is most closely related to the chimpanzee in this example, right? So that's an example of how we would look and see how two things are more closely related. And we would say that from an evolutionary standpoint, they have branched off from a similar common ancestor more recently than others. All right, the next bit of evolutionary evidence that we have are looking at fossils. Remember, fossils are remnants of previous living organisms that we can look at on actually observe, and we can observe how they are different and similar to living organisms that are present today on the earth. So fossils again point back to that common ancestor. Okay, this idea of common ancestry is a common theme for the theory of evolution, that all living things came from some common ancestor. So a missing link is a transitional fossil that exhibits traits common to both the ancestral group and its descendants. So for instance, if we look at the Achyopteryx, that's the one that bridged the gap between the dinosaur and present-day birds. So this fossil here that was discovered would be a missing link that tells us how we went from dinosaurs to things like chickens on Earth. So fossils allow us to look back into the past and compare the organisms that lived in the past with organisms living today, and help us to fill in the missing pieces of how those organisms might have evolved. Now, scientists are also able to determine how old fossils are by using a process called radioactive dating. Radioactive dating is whenever we look at the rock that the fossils are found in, and we determine the age of the rock. And this can be done by doing carbon dating and looking at the amount of isotopes that have changed. We won't actually be covering that, but that is a process that's done. And so when we can figure out how old it is, we were able to determine when these different organisms are living. And also that helps us to provide how they could have been related. So obviously if some live millions of years apart, they're not going to be as closely related as some that only live several thousands of years apart. So by looking at our fossil record, we're also able to gather evidence to support our theory of evolution. All right, lastly, we're going to talk about comparative anatomy. So this is when we just look at the anatomical structures of different organisms. And so we have two different types of structures, homologous structures and analogous structures. So homologous structure is, you need to add this to your thing. A homologous structure means that it has a different form. Well, actually, different function, but a similar form. Okay, so homologous structures are going to look alike, but they're going to do a different job for that organism. So, for instance, this would be like the wrist bones in humans and in dogs. So, obviously, in humans, we use our wrist bones for something very different than a dog. Dogs use them to walk on. We use them as a part of our hand, which allows us to grip things and move and climb and things like that. Homologous structures show that organisms must have come from a common ancestor, because even though we use them differently, they are still they're similar in form and shape. Vestigial structures are structures that are basically left over. So you've probably heard that the appendix is a vestigial organ. It's not an organ that we use or that we need now. That's called a vestigial organ. That is evidence that populations are changing due to natural selection. Okay, so those structures are becoming obsolete or no longer needed. So over time, as the environment changes, natural selection, remember, it works by the best suited for the environment are going to be the ones that survive and reproduce, making the most favorable traits the most common in the population. And so eventually, if those structures are no longer needed or used, then they're just going to be left over and passed down. So this is showing that populations do change over time, because we still do see these remnants of different types of structures that we no longer need. So the appendix would be one. Getting goosebumps is one. The ability to wiggle your ears in humans, that there's a muscle in your ear that is a vestigial organ. So some people are able to wiggle their ears and some people are not able to wiggle their ears. In whales, in addition, the hind limbs in the whales are still there, even though obviously they don't walk, they swim, they're ocean bound. So those are left over from when they were land dwelling organisms. All right, lastly, we have analogous structures. Analogous structures are similar to homologous structures, but they're actually the exact opposite. So an analogous structure, and you need to write this down, means that they are similar function, but a different form or a different shape. Okay, so they do the same job, but they look differently. And so this is because the species live in similar environments, and so they evolve similarly because of the niches that they live in and the traits that arise due to natural selection. So for instance, if you look at bats and birds, they both have wings to fly, but the shape and the structure of their wings are very different. Again, if you compare a bird to an insect that flies, their wing structures are going to be very different, but they're both giving that organism the ability to fly. So again, similar function, but a different form. And this points back to the idea that environment causes organisms to change and evolve over time, as organisms with the best adapted traits are able to survive and reproduce better in the environment. All right, so that is the conclusion of our video over the evidence of evolution. You need to make sure that you understand the ones especially that I discussed in this video, in addition to the ones that were in your POGIL, but especially the homologous structures and analogous structures. They love to ask questions about that on the STAR test, as well as the DNA comparison and the embryology and the fossils. So just make sure you have all of this information down in your brain, and when you are done, make sure you get this checked off and move on to the next assignment.